14 months after I buried my brother's ashes beneath a maple tree in our mother's backyard, an insurance fraud investigator sat across from me at my own kitchen table and asked me a question that made the floor of my entire world tilt sideways. "Ferreira, I need you to look at this photograph very carefully, and I need you to tell me honestly whether that's your brother." Photograph showed a man buying groceries at a Costco in Boise, Idaho, a city my brother had never once, in 36 years of life, mentioned any connection to. The man had a slightly different haircut, a beard my brother never wore, 30 additional pounds he'd never carried in his life. But the eyes, and a very specific, small scar above his left eyebrow from a bike accident when he was 9 years old, a scar I'd been present for, a scar I could have picked out of 1,000 strangers' faces without hesitation, were unmistakably, impossibly my brother's. Daniel Ferreira had not died in a car accident on a rural Montana highway 14 months earlier. The way the state troopers report, the funeral home, and the $875,000 life insurance payout I had received as his named beneficiary all insisted he had. He was alive, living under a different name, in a different state, and I was the one who had unknowingly, innocently collected the insurance money that had made his disappearance possible. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, and in today's story about a family member who wasn't behind a closed door at all, but somehow, impossibly, hiding in plain sight the entire time. Today's story is called The Urn That Was Empty. Let's begin. My name is Christina Ferreira Wilkes. I'm 39 years old. I work as a hospital administrator in Denver, and my younger brother, Daniel Ferreira, was, for 36 years, the person I was closest to in the entire world. Closer, honestly, than either of us was to our own parents. Closer than I've ever been to my own husband, in the specific, particular way that siblings who have weathered a genuinely difficult childhood together sometimes become each other's primary source of safety and understanding. Our parents divorced when I was 11, and Daniel was 7, in a bitter, prolonged process that left both of us, for several difficult years, navigating a chaotic custody arrangement, and eventually our mother's remarriage to a man neither of us ever fully trusted. Daniel and I raised each other in the specific, essential ways siblings sometimes do when the adults around them are too consumed by their own difficulties to fully show up. I made sure he ate dinner on the nights our mother worked late. He was, later, the person I called first with every genuine crisis in my adult life, long after we'd both moved into our own separate, ordinary adult existences. Daniel struggled, throughout his 20s and early 30s, with a pattern of financial instability that I understood, at the time, as an ordinary if frustrating extension of a difficult, unstable childhood. A series of business ventures that never quite succeeded, mounting credit card debt he was never fully transparent with me about, a gambling habit he'd periodically, unconvincingly claimed to have under control. I loved him completely, and I also worried about him constantly, in the specific, exhausting way you worry about someone you love who seems perpetually one bad decision away from real catastrophe. Daniel married a woman named Priya roughly 5 years before this story begins, a relationship I'd always found somewhat difficult to fully read, marked by a specific, guarded quality between them that I chalked up, at the time, to Priya's more private, reserved personality rather than anything more concerning. 14 months before I discovered the photograph that appended everything, I received a phone call from a Montana state trooper informing me that my brother's car had been found, severely damaged, at the bottom of a ravine along a remote stretch of highway in western Montana, roughly 2 hours from Missoula, where Daniel had told me, in a call just 3 days earlier, that he was traveling for what he described as a potential business opportunity. he was excited but characteristically vague about. The trooper explained that Daniel's vehicle had, based on the physical evidence at the scene, apparently gone off the road during a nighttime rainstorm, careening down a steep embankment into a fast-moving river swollen with recent runoff. Search and rescue efforts, conducted over the following several days, recovered the vehicle, but due to the river's strong current and the remote, difficult terrain, were unable to recover Daniel's body. A circumstance the trooper explained, with what I understood at the time, as genuine professional compassion, was tragically not uncommon in that specific stretch of Montana River during peak spring runoff. I want to describe what those following weeks actually felt like, because I think it matters enormously to understanding how the fraud that eventually came to light was able to succeed as completely as it did. There was no body to formally identify, which meant no immediate, concrete confirmation, but there was also, according to everything the investigating authorities told me at the time, no realistic possibility that Daniel could have survived. A swift-moving, ice-cold Montana river, a severely damaged vehicle, and an extended search and rescue effort that found no trace of him. All pointing toward a conclusion so consistently reinforced by every official source I encountered that genuine doubt never had a meaningful opportunity to take root. Montana law, following a legally mandated waiting period, and a formal presumption of death preceding that Priya, as Daniel's wife, initiated roughly 7 weeks after the accident, ultimately issued a death certificate, allowing the necessary legal and financial processes, including, critically, the disbursement of Daniel's life insurance policy, to move forward. I held a memorial service for my brother roughly 3 months after the accident, in the absence of any recoverable remains, a service attended by nearly 100 people who had genuinely loved him, and I buried a small urn, containing, I was told at the time, a symbolic collection of personal items in lieu of actual ashes, beneath the maple tree in our mother's backyard, where Daniel and I had spent countless hours of our shared, difficult childhood. Daniel had, several years earlier, taken out a life insurance policy valued at $875,000, nomming me, rather than Priya, as the primary beneficiary. A decision he'd explained to me at the time he first mentioned the policy, roughly 4 years before his apparent death, as reflecting his ongoing concern about what he described as financial complications in his marriage to Priya that he never fully elaborated on, alongside his stated desire to ensure that, if anything ever happened to him, our mother, whose own retirement finances remained precarious, would be genuinely, reliably provided for through me rather than through what he described as a considerably less certain arrangement with Priya. I received the insurance payout roughly 5 months after the accident, following the formal presumption of death ruling and the completion of the insurance company's standard claims investigation. A process that, I would later learn, had included its own internal review, but had, given the consistent, corroborating official evidence from the Montana authorities, ultimately approved the claim without significant additional scrutiny. I used the majority of that money, in the months that followed, exactly the way Daniel had told me he intended, establishing a meaningful trust for our mother's ongoing care and retirement security, alongside setting aside a portion for my own 2 children's future education. I want to be entirely honest and clear about this, because it becomes directly relevant to the fraud investigation that eventually unfolded. I received, used, and distributed that insurance money in complete, genuine good faith, believing, with absolute certainty, that my brother had actually died. The insurance fraud investigator who appeared at my door 14 months after the accident, a methodical, careful man named Gregory Ashworth working on behalf of the insurance company that had paid out Daniel's policy, explained, Once I'd let him in and we were seated at my kitchen table, that his agency's ongoing, routine post-payout review process, a standard practice, he explained, for claims above a certain threshold, conducted well after the initial payout to catch exactly this category of fraud that sometimes doesn't surface until well after a claim has already been paid, had flagged several irregularities in Daniel's case that had prompted a renewed, more thorough investigation. I want to be very clear that we don't currently believe you were knowingly involved in any fraud, Gregory told me, early in our conversation, a reassurance that did little in the moment to calm the specific, mounting dread building as he continued explaining the reason for his visit. But we have reason to believe your brother's death may have been staged, and we need your help determining whether that's actually the case. He explained that the investigation had begun with a routine cross-reference of recent, unrelated financial fraud cases the insurance company's broader investigative division was tracking, which had surfaced a pattern connecting several other, seemingly unrelated life insurance claims across different states to a specific, small network of individuals believed to be facilitating staged deaths for a fee arranging vehicle accidents in remote, difficult-to-search locations, coordinating fraudulent identification for the person's new life under an assumed identity, and structuring the surrounding circumstances specifically to survive the kind of routine, initial claims scrutiny that Daniel's case had, in fact, initially survived. Gregory then showed me the photograph, the Costco surveillance image, obtained. He explained, through a facial recognition match the insurance company's broader fraud investigation had run against a database of recent, similarly structured claims. A match that had specifically flagged the man in that Boise, Idaho photograph as a person of interest connected to this broader pattern, well before any specific connection to my brother's case had been established. I looked at that photograph, at the small, specific scar above the man's left eyebrow, and felt something in my chest collapse entirely. I want to explain, specifically, why that scar carried such absolute, unambiguous certainty for me, because I think it's important for you to understand exactly how I knew, immediately and completely, that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or an unsettling but ultimately meaningless resemblance. When Daniel was 9 years old, he'd fallen off his bike on the steep, graveled driveway of our childhood home, catching his left eyebrow on the sharp edge of a garden retaining wall as he went down. I was 13 at the time, home alone with him while our mother worked a late shift, and I had been the one to apply pressure to the wound, the one to make the decision, in a moment of genuine, frightened responsibility beyond my years, about whether the cut needed stitches, ultimately driving him myself, at 13, illegally and terrified, the short distance to a walk-in clinic because our mother couldn't be reached and I didn't know what else to do. The resulting scar, a small, distinctive, slightly curved mark just above his left eyebrow, had been part of Daniel's face for the following 27 years, a detail so completely familiar to me that I hadn't consciously thought about its specific shape in years. The way you stop consciously noticing the most familiar features of someone you've known your entire life, until, suddenly, confronted with it in an unfamiliar context, on an unfamiliar face wearing an unfamiliar beard, that specific. Small detail became the single, unmistakable piece of evidence that cut through every other layer of disguise or unfamiliarity. "That's my brother," I told Gregory, my voice barely steady. "I don't know how, and I don't know why, but that's absolutely, unmistakably my brother." Gregory's investigation, once my identification of the photograph confirmed the connection warranting a fully expanded inquiry, turned its focus, in the following weeks, toward Priya, Daniel's wife, whose own actions in the months immediately following the accident took on an entirely different, considerably more sinister meaning in light of what we now understood. Priya had, according to records Gregory's investigation obtained, filed the formal presumption of death petition with unusual, notable speed following the accident, moving through the legal process with an efficiency that, in retrospect, suggested considerably more preparation and coordination than a grieving, disoriented spouse navigating an unfamiliar legal process for the first time would typically demonstrate. She had, additionally, according to financial records Gregory's investigation, eventually obtained through formal subpoena, once the fraud investigation reached a sufficiently advanced stage, received a separate life insurance payout of her own. A smaller policy, valued at roughly $150,000, that Daniel had also maintained, nomming her as beneficiary, alongside what appeared to be several substantial transfers from Daniel's own remaining accounts into accounts Priya controlled. Executed in the weeks immediately preceding the reported accident, transfers that, examined now with the benefit of hindsight, suggested deliberate, advanced financial preparation for exactly the kind of disappearance that had ultimately occurred. I confronted Priya directly, once Gregory's investigation had progressed far enough that he advised me it was appropriate to do so, sitting across from her at a coffee shop in Denver, where she'd relocated roughly 8 months after the accident. A conversation I'd requested, uncertain, going in, whether she would even agree to meet with me at all. Priya's reaction, when I laid out what Gregory's investigation had uncovered, was not the shocked denial I had, some part of me still hoped for, still wanting, even at that late stage, some version of this story where my brother's apparent death remained genuinely, tragically real rather than a deliberate, orchestrated fraud. "I need you to understand something," Priya said, her voice tight, controlled, carrying an exhaustion that suggested she'd been anticipating this exact conversation for months. Daniel owed money to people who don't operate through normal legal channels. Real money, Christina. Money from a gambling debt that had gotten considerably worse and considerably more dangerous than anything he ever let you know about. He came to me, about 8 months before the accident, terrified in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him before, telling me he believed his life was in actual, serious danger if he couldn't find a way to disappear completely and permanently. This wasn't a scheme born out of greed, Christina. It was born out of fear. Over the following several difficult, emotionally exhausting conversations, both with Priya directly and through the expanding formal investigation Gregory's agency conducted, alongside eventual FBI involvement once the interstate nature of the insurance fraud and the apparent debt-related motivation became clear, a fuller, considerably more complicated picture of what had actually happened emerged. Daniel had, in fact, accumulated a genuinely dangerous gambling debt, roughly $340,000, owed to an organized network operating out of several western states, a debt that had escalated, in the months before the staged accident, into explicit, credible threats against both his and, at various points, Priya's physical safety. Rather than seeking help through legitimate channels, law enforcement, debt counseling, even, painfully, simply confiding fully in me, the sister who had spent his entire life being the person he called first with every crisis, Daniel had, apparently through a contact made during his years of gambling in increasingly desperate circles, connected with the network Gregory's broader investigation had already begun tracking. A network that specialized specifically in facilitating staged deaths for individuals in exactly Daniel's kind of desperate, dangerous financial situation, in exchange for a substantial fee, funded, in Daniel's case, by a combination of his own remaining assets and a portion of the very life insurance payouts his staged death would ultimately generate. I want to be honest about how difficult it was, hearing this fuller picture, to hold the genuine, complicated sympathy I felt for the terror my brother must have experienced, facing what he apparently believed to be a genuine, credible threat to his life, Alongside the equally genuine, difficult anger I felt about the specific way he had chosen to handle that terror. A choice that had, whatever his underlying motivation, resulted in a 14-month fraud against an insurance company. A fraudulent presumption of death legal proceeding, and most painfully and personally, a 14-month period during which I had genuinely, completely believed my brother was dead, grieving him with the full, unguarded intensity of someone who had lost the person closest to her in the entire world, while he was, the entire time, alive, hiding, and as far as I could determine, never once attempting to reach me or let me know the truth. I asked Priya, during one of our later, somewhat more settled conversations, why Daniel had never found a way, even carefully, even indirectly, to let me know he was still alive, given how close we had always been, given how completely he must have understood the specific, devastating grief his apparent death would cause me. He talked about you constantly, in the weeks before everything happened, Priya told me. He was more afraid of what telling you would mean for your own safety than he was afraid of your grief. The people he owed money to are the kind of people who use every possible piece of leverage against someone who's disappeared on them. If you'd known he was alive, and if that knowledge had ever, even accidentally, become discoverable, a slip in a phone call, a piece of digital evidence, anything, it wouldn't just have exposed his location. It could have made you a target too, as someone who could theoretically lead them back to him. He convinced himself that your genuine, complete grief, however devastating, was actually the safer path for both of you, compared to the risk of you carrying a secret that dangerous people might eventually find a way to extract from you. I don't know, even now, how fully I believe that specific justification, whether it reflects genuine, if badly misguided, protective reasoning on Daniel's part, or whether it functions, at least in part, as a retrospective rationalization Priya has constructed to make an objectively devastating choice feel more understandable, both to me and perhaps to herself. What I do know is that whatever combination of genuine fear and flawed judgment led to that specific choice, the result was 14 months of grief I experienced in complete, unnecessary good faith for a brother who was, the entire time, alive. Gregory's investigation, now expanded to include FBI involvement given the interstate insurance fraud and the connection to what investigators believed was an organized fraud network operating across multiple states, ultimately located Daniel roughly 6 weeks after Priya's initial confirmation of his survival, living under an assumed identity in Boise, Idaho, working under a false name and fabricated identification documents as a contractor for a local construction firm. I want to describe the specific, disorienting experience of the following weeks, as law enforcement coordinated Daniel's eventual arrest, and my own understanding of the situation continued to develop through ongoing conversations with Gregory, and eventually, the FBI agent assigned to the broader fraud network investigation, Special Agent Denise Cho. I want to be clear with you about the legal situation your brother is now facing, Agent Cho told me during one of our early briefing conversations. Faking one's own death is not, on its own, a specific federal crime in most circumstances. Genuinely disappearing, changing your identity, is legally complicated but not automatically criminal in itself. What makes this a serious federal matter is the insurance fraud specifically, the fraudulent presumption of death legal proceeding Priya initiated on his behalf, and most significantly, his apparent connection to and payment of a network that specializes in facilitating exactly this kind of fraud for other clients, which implicates him in a considerably broader conspiracy beyond just his own individual case. I asked Agent Cho, directly, whether I, as the unknowing recipient of the $875,000 insurance payout, faced any legal exposure myself, a question that had been sitting, with genuine and mounting anxiety, at the center of my own concerns throughout this entire ordeal. "Based on everything we've established so far," Agent Cho said, "the evidence strongly supports that you received and used those funds in complete good faith, with no knowledge that your brother's death had been staged. That distinction matters enormously, legally. You're not currently a target of this investigation, but I want to be honest that the insurance company will very likely pursue civil recovery of the funds you received, since the underlying claim, however innocently you received it, was based on a fraudulent death that never actually occurred. The insurance company, once Daniel's staged death was formally confirmed through the criminal investigation, did indeed pursue civil recovery of the full $875,000 payout, a legal reality that, whatever moral sympathy I might have felt for the specific circumstances driving my brother's desperate choice, placed me in the genuinely difficult, painful position of needing to unwind a trust I had established for our mother's retirement security and a college fund I had established for my own children, both funded with money that, however innocently received, legally belonged to the insurance company rather than to my family. I retained my own attorney, a civil litigation specialist named Robert Halloran, to negotiate this recovery process, given the genuine complexity of unwinding funds that had already been distributed, and, in the case of the trust established for our mother, partially utilized for her ongoing living expenses over the preceding 14 months. Robert negotiated, ultimately, a structured repayment arrangement that accounted for the funds already genuinely, necessarily spent on our mother's care, while establishing a clear timeline for recovering the remaining, still available portion of the original payout. A resolution that, while considerably less painful than an immediate, full demand for the entire original sum, still represented a genuine, significant financial setback for both my mother's retirement security and my own children's education fund, planning I had built, in complete good faith, around money that had, it turned out, never legitimately belonged to any of us in the first place. I want to be honest about the specific, complicated anger I felt, working through this financial unwinding process, directed not primarily at the insurance company, which was, after all, simply recovering funds paid out based on a fraud it hadn't committed, but at my brother, whose choices had not only caused 14 months of unnecessary, devastating grief, but had also left our mother's retirement security and my children's educational future genuinely, materially worse off than if he had simply, honestly confided in me about his actual, dangerous situation from the very beginning. I visited Daniel, roughly 4 months after his arrest, at the federal detention facility where he was being held pending trial on charges including insurance fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy related to his connection with the broader staged death network. A visit I want to describe honestly, because it was, without question, one of the most emotionally complicated experiences of my entire life. Seeing my brother's face again, in person, after 14 months of genuine, unresolved grief followed by weeks of a considerably more confusing, unresolved mixture of relief and fury, produced a specific, overwhelming wave of emotion I struggled, throughout most of that visit, to fully articulate or process in real time. "I'm so sorry," Daniel told me, within the first few minutes of our conversation, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard from him since we were children. "I know sorry doesn't come close to being enough. I know what I put you through. I think about it every single day, what it must have been like for you, believing I was actually gone, and I don't have any way to make that right, no matter what I say." "You could have told me," I said, my own voice shaking. "Even carefully, even in some coded, indirect way, I would have found a way to help you, Daniel. I would have figured out something, anything, other than letting me bury an empty urn under Mom's maple tree and grieve you for 14 months for absolutely no reason." "I know," he said. "I've had 14 months to understand exactly how wrong that specific choice was, sitting alone in Boise, watching you and Mom and everyone who loved me carry a grief I created, unable to do anything to fix it without making everything considerably worse for both of us. I told myself at the time that I was protecting you. I understand now that I was really just protecting myself from having to face what I'd actually done, by keeping you far enough away that you couldn't talk me out of it, or convince me there was a better option than the one I'd already decided on." That specific admission, that his silence had, in part, been about avoiding my potential objection rather than purely about protecting my safety, did more to help me process this entire ordeal than almost anything else he said during that visit, because it finally offered something closer to full, unguarded honesty than the more purely protective narrative Priya had initially offered on his behalf. Daniel's federal trial, held roughly 10 months after his arrest, resulted in a plea agreement rather than a full trial. Once his attorney and federal prosecutors reached a negotiated resolution reflecting his cooperation in providing detailed information about the broader staged death network he'd been connected to, information that, according to Agent Cho, proved significantly valuable in the government's ongoing, broader investigation into that network's operations across multiple states. Daniel pleaded guilty to charges of wire fraud and insurance fraud, receiving a sentence that included a substantial period of federal incarceration, alongside a formal restitution order requiring him to repay over time. Both the insurance companies recovered losses, and separately, a portion of what our family had genuinely, necessarily spent from the trust before the fraud came to light. Priya faced a separate legal proceeding, given her own direct role in initiating the fraudulent presumption of death petition and receiving her own separate insurance payout, ultimately reaching her own plea agreement resulting in a somewhat shorter period of incarceration, reflecting, according to her attorney's arguments, that the court apparently found at least partially persuasive. Her own more limited role, compared to Daniel's direct engagement with the broader criminal network that had facilitated the entire scheme. I want to be honest that I did not testify against Daniel in any adversarial sense, given the plea agreement's resolution of the case before any formal trial proceeding required my testimony, but I did provide a victim impact statement to the court, describing, as honestly and completely as I could manage, the specific, genuine devastation of the 14 months I spent grieving a brother who was, the entire time, alive. A statement I understood the sentencing judge to have genuinely, seriously weighed alongside the broader circumstances of Daniel's case, including the genuine, credible danger he had apparently been facing from his original creditors, a factor his attorney argued, and the prosecution ultimately did not seriously dispute, mitigated at least somewhat the moral, if not the legal, weight of his underlying choice to stage his own death rather than pursue any legitimate alternative. I want to spend real time here on our mother's experience throughout this entire ordeal, because I think her particular grief and her particular process of processing what happened deserves more attention than I've given it so far in this telling. Our mother, already navigating her own considerable grief throughout the original 14 months following Daniel's apparent death, experienced the revelation that he was actually alive with a complicated, difficult mixture of relief and a specific, profound anger that, in some ways, exceeded even my own. I spent 14 months visiting an empty urn under that maple tree, she told me, during one particularly difficult conversation roughly a month after Daniel's arrest. I talked to him there, Christina. I told him things I never got the chance to tell him while he was actually, genuinely alive to hear them, because I thought that urn was the closest I'd ever get to him again. And the whole time, he was alive, choosing, deliberately, not to let either of us know that every single one of those conversations was happening in front of an empty container, for no reason except a choice he made without ever giving either of us the chance to help him make a different one. Mother has, in the time since, maintained a considerably more limited, more cautious relationship with Daniel than I have declining, so far, to visit him during his incarceration, communicating only occasionally through brief, carefully bounded letters, processing, in her own way and on her own timeline, a betrayal that, for her, layered on top of an already difficult lifetime of navigating Daniel's periodic instability and unreliability throughout his adult life. I don't think there's a single, correct way for a family to process something this specific and this devastating, and I've tried, throughout the time since, to respect that my mother's path toward whatever eventual resolution she reaches with Daniel may look genuinely different from my own, without either of us needing to fully agree on the timeline or the ultimate shape that resolution takes. I want to describe something that happened roughly a year after Daniel's arrest, once the legal proceedings had substantially concluded, and our family had begun, slowly and imperfectly, the process of figuring out what our ongoing relationship with Daniel, and with each other, was actually going to look like going forward. I drove out to our mother's house on an ordinary Saturday afternoon and found her standing beneath the maple tree in her backyard, the same tree where we had buried that small, symbolic urn nearly 2 years earlier, standing there with a small garden trowel in her hand. "I dug it up," she told me, when I approached, gesturing toward a small, disturbed patch of earth at the base of the tree, an empty hole where the urn had once been buried. I couldn't keep it there anymore, knowing what I know now. It felt like it was mocking me every time I looked out this window and saw that spot, knowing there was never actually anything real in it to begin with. I asked her what she'd done with the urn. "I threw it away," she said simply. "Not out of anger exactly, or maybe partly out of anger, mostly because I think I needed the ground under that tree to just be ground again, not a monument to a lie, however unintentional the lie was on my part and yours. If Daniel ever actually dies, someday, for real, I'll figure out then what I want to do to remember him properly. Until then, I don't want an empty container out here pretending to be something it never was." I sat with her, beneath that maple tree, for a long time that afternoon, both of us quiet, processing in our own separate ways, the strange, specific grief of having genuinely mourned someone who turned out to still be alive. A grief that, we were both discovering, didn't simply resolve or reverse itself the moment the truth came out, but instead sat alongside the relief and the anger, its own distinct, complicated, ongoing thing that neither of us fully knew how to fully put down. I want to share something I've come to understand, in the 2 years since this entire ordeal began, about the specific, dangerous combination of fear and shame that led my brother toward the choice he ultimately made. Because I think it offers a genuinely useful, if difficult, lesson for anyone watching this who might be carrying their own hidden financial crisis, too afraid or too ashamed to bring it to the people who love them. Daniel's choice to stage his own death, rather than confiding in me, in our mother, or in legitimate law enforcement channels, about the genuine danger he was apparently facing, reflected, I've come to believe, not primarily a failure of love for his family, but a specific, catastrophic failure of his own belief that we would actually be capable of helping him if he told us the truth. He had spent years, by that point, quietly managing an escalating financial crisis largely alone, ashamed, I think, of a pattern of instability he'd never fully, honestly shared with me even during our closest, most trusting conversations throughout our entire lives together. I don't say this to excuse what he ultimately did, which caused genuine, significant harm to me, to our mother, and to the broader financial and legal systems his fraud exploited. But I do think there's a genuinely important lesson here about the specific, corrosive danger of shame around financial difficulty, and about how that shame, left unaddressed and unshared for long enough, can eventually escalate someone toward considering choices that would have seemed, at an earlier, less desperate stage of the same underlying crisis, genuinely unthinkable. If you're carrying a financial crisis right now that feels too shameful, too overwhelming, too frightening to share with the people who love you, I want to say, directly, informed by everything this story has taught me the hard way. The people who genuinely love you would far rather help you navigate a real, honest crisis, however difficult or embarrassing, than grieve you, genuinely and completely, for a death that never needed to happen at all. For every family carrying a secret too heavy to share if you're watching this and you, or someone you love, is carrying a genuine crisis, financial, legal, or otherwise, that feels too shameful or too dangerous to share honestly with the people closest to you, I want to say something directly to you, informed by everything my family learned through this specific, devastating ordeal. Secrecy very rarely makes a genuine crisis safer. It very often, instead, simply delays the moment the people who love you learn the truth, while foreclosing in the meantime. Whatever genuine help or alternative solutions those people might have been able to offer, had they known in time to actually help rather than simply, eventually, discover the full scope of what had already happened. If you are facing genuine danger, from creditors, from threats, from any circumstance that feels overwhelming and frightening enough that disappearing seems like the only remaining option, please, before considering any drastic, irreversible choice, reach out to legitimate resources. Law enforcement, a genuine financial or legal advocate, a witness protection or victim assistance program if actual criminal threats are involved. These resources exist precisely because you are not the first person to face genuine, frightening danger, and the people equipped to help you navigate it safely and legally are considerably more capable of protecting you than any staged disappearance, however carefully planned, could ever actually be. My brother is alive. That fact remains, even now, a source of genuine, complicated relief amid everything else this story required my family to carry. But I would give almost anything to have had the chance to actually help him, honestly and in real time, rather than grieving him for 14 months under an empty urn, for a death that, however dangerous his underlying circumstances genuinely were, never actually needed to happen at all. My name is Christina Ferreira Wilkes, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a secret, a crisis, or a burden someone in your life might be carrying alone, reach out to them today and tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.